Hello and good morning, everyone, and welcome to your morning briefing for Tuesday, the 29th of July, 2025. I'm your host, Mike Shelby. We have a lot to cover today. One thing we're going to spend a fair amount of time talking about is Fortress North America, why this US-EU trade deal is so important. I mean, we're talking about realignment here of things that we have seen happen over the past 20 years, basically being reversed. So with that, Robert, good morning. Let's go ahead and jump inside the Beltway here, starting with the Senate.
Good morning, Mike. So the Senate's planning to vote on a package of must-pass spending bills this week, and this is ahead of the Senate's August recess. The Senate did vote 90-8 to advance three of these must-pass spending bills to the Senate floor. However, as we've reported recently, Senate Democrats have been under major pressure from the Democratic vote-based voters to resist the Trump administration, and I think they could threaten a partial government shutdown by 30 September to gain concessions from Senate Republicans. And I also think based on the response to Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer earlier this year, voting for that continuing resolution, they could be more likely to risk a partial government shutdown by 30 September.
Robert, I think this, just briefly, I think it's a very important point because we have heard from a lot of prominent Democrats. One of those Democrats said, maybe we were too cooperative with Republicans earlier this year on that continuing resolution fight. And he said, maybe next time we don't do that. And it sure seems like there's a lot of support among rank and file Democrats for these leaders in the Senate and also Democrats in the House to just dig in their heels and basically be the party of no as much as they can. So I actually think Senate Democrats, there's a real risk that they actually do try to force a shutdown, believing that it would be bad for Republicans and Trump.
And moving over to the House, the Democrat-aligned House Majority Political Action Committee said it's created a $20 million fund. They're calling it the Lone Star Fund. And this is going to target Republican incumbent Congress members in Texas. And this is if Texas Republicans move forward with redistricting plans. The PAC president named Mike Smith, he said that this new fund is actually a bid to scare these incumbent Republican representatives into opposing this redistricting plan. I think this move is coming because Democrats are running into major hurdles in their own attempts to do this mid decade redistricting in blue states, where they have a lot more legal obstacles. So they're basically trying to head Republicans off at the pass, because I think the projection is that Republicans could pick up 5 seats just in Texas through this redistricting. And then staying in Texas, there's a Texas-based company called Campus Guardian Angels. I believe they're headquartered in Austin, and they hosted a demonstration yesterday for the Leon County School District. And what they demonstrated was the use of FPV drones to target potential school shooters, specifically physically ramming targets and also firing pepper balls at these demonstration targets. But what I found the most interesting in some of the coverage of this is that the Leon County Superintendent named Rocky Hanna, he said that they might not go with this program because it's too expensive. I think the estimate was like $1 million per year, but they are considering incorporating other types of drone programs in their school security program. And the CEO of this company has actually said that they have successfully signed up some private and charter schools in Texas to this drone security program already.
All right, interesting. Thanks for that, Robert. And let's go ahead and move on to the global sit rep. Starting with Chile. This is very important. Chile is the top exporter for copper in the world.
Yeah.
What's going on with the copper tariffs?
Yes. So they're not only top exporter, they're the top producer, and I think also the top refiner, actually. They're pretty, if they're not the top refiner, they're pretty high up there. So this is coming from Chile's finance minister. He said yesterday in an interview that he's looking for a special exemption on copper tariffs in the trade deal he's currently working out with the United States. Now, he said this is because it wouldn't be very useful for us to have a trade agreement that excludes more than half of our exports to the U.S., such as copper and wood. Basically, hey, our entire trade depends on this. Don't tariff us at 50%, because that would, for Chile, what this would effectively be is a 50% tariff across the board. We will see, because the U.S. is trying to put refining back here in the United States. Nevertheless, it is important to actually keep an eye on this. Moving over to Israel, we've covered a couple times calls for Israeli influence operations here in the United States. One was funded by the Israeli foreign minister. This one is coming from an Israeli research analyst who, per his profile, regularly briefs members of Congress and their staffs. That's the U.S. Congress, not the Knesset. He did say that he briefs the Knesset as well. But he's calling for a broader campaign to improve Israel's image in the United States. And now his plan it has several pillars, but it includes messaging from the prime minister all the way down to the Israeli diaspora. So basically everybody involved, and reaching out to people under 45. He said millennials and Gen Zs, but millennials, I think, top out around 45 right now, with narrative-driven content. And this is in response to a much larger trend that he said was part of Israel's national security that was captured by a Quinnipiac poll, showing that even Republicans have seen a 14% drop in support for Israel since 2024.
Yeah, I've noticed scrolling on Instagram how many conservative influencers are suddenly posting about their all expenses paid trip to Israel.
Yeah.
Interesting. All right. Thanks for that, Jared.
Some big news from yesterday. Taiwanese President Lai canceled his annual trip to his remaining allies in Latin America after the Trump administration told him, no, you will not stop over in New York. Lai, in his address to his written statement to the Taiwanese public, said that the reason he's canceling it is because they were recently hit with a typhoon and he wants to be there for recovery. Had nothing to do with the Trump administration, though inside sources were saying, yes, it did. Kind of a, he said, she said thing. Now, Lai initially planned 2 stops in the United States, one on August 4th and one on the 14th of August. Now, I really think this is just because Besant has pretty harsh negotiations going on with China right now in Stockholm. And every time a Taiwanese president makes a stopover in the United States, China reacts very poorly. And at that same time, there were already calls from Congress for Secretary Rubio to have an official meeting with Lai during one of those stopovers. That would not have gone well.
Interesting.
And then moving over to Ukraine, made pretty big news yesterday. President Trump said that he's reducing Russia's deadline for the ceasefire from 50 days down to 10 or 12 days. He said he will confirm it either last night or today. So we should see this, much more solidified today. And this is for the issuance of secondary tariffs on Russia's remaining trade partners. Now, concurrent to this, the Turkish president offered follow-on peace talks between Russian President Vladimir Putin and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky in Istanbul. And they just had delegation talks last week. But I thought it was important that, Turkey is still actually pressing for this. They are actually a pretty significant trade partner for Russia anyway. So they have an interest in getting that done, and there's already a venue for it. It's just a matter of Russia and Ukraine actually coming to the table on this.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, we'll keep our fingers crossed. Thanks for that, Jared. And got tracking 60 protests today, which is a bit above baseline. Moving on. All right, let's talk about this op-ed. There's a far-left media outlet that published an opinion editorial piece about kind of the state of the far left and the state of the Trump movement. And they said that they admitted that their movement does not have the power or the organization yet to launch any form of mass resistance. But they are obviously encouraging activists and militants to continue organizing. In the interim, they called for the far left to continue building local organizations and also to begin preparing for labor union strikes and engaging in, quote, increasingly disruptive protests against the Trump administration. I'll tell you, I've seen a huge divergence between the expectations of left-wing resistance by conservative or by the right and their actual capacity to do the things that the right has expected them to do, by and large. There were a lot of predictions about how 2025 was going to be Summer of Love 2.0. And last year, I pushed hard back against that. I said it's extremely low likelihood that anything major, anything nearing 2020 is going to pop off this year. And I said that because the left was still rebuilding, especially these far left groups. They are still rebuilding. They don't, they don't have the cards yet. And so it's interesting to read stuff like this coming directly from far left media outlets, admitting that they're still in this rebuilding process. They're still trying to gain traction. I think in many cases, they're still, I think the far left is still fighting to remain relevant outside of their tiny bubbles. And that's where we are. I'll continue to pay attention to it. All right, let's go ahead and move on and talk about maybe the end of birthright citizenship. Robert, it's interesting to see that there's actually a plan being put forward now to match this executive order. Ultimately, this is going to rest with the Supreme Court. Is that correct?
Correct. Because this is currently, for the third time, the implementation of this executive order was blocked in the Federal District Court of Massachusetts. I think that was last week. So this fight is, I think, definitely going to escalate to the Supreme Court. But this plan was released by the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services last Friday to implement this executive order, and it would block birthright citizenship for children born on U.S. soil to both a mother who is unlawfully in the U.S. or has a lawful but temporary status, like one of the immigration parole programs, if the father is either not a U.S. citizen or lawful permanent resident. And I did read through this plan, and it's not a complete moratorium on birthright citizenship. Specifically, anyone who with a legal refugee status has been someone who's been granted asylum, or certain other non-citizen categories like U.S. nationals that do not have citizenship, so like residents of some U.S. territories, are not going to be affected. But the way this is actually being implemented is the USCIS is redefining what under the jurisdiction of means to block birthright citizenship for most categories of both legal and illegal non-residents. And I think importantly, this does include non-immigrant visa holders, because it's very common for foreign nationals, like wealthy Chinese nationals, to travel to the U.S. to give birth so they can obtain dual citizenship for their children.
Yeah, certainly. Is there any indication? So this is held up still at the federal, whatever court level. Could we see a fall ruling by the Supreme Court, or when might we expect something like this?
I'm going to keep an eye out for what cases the Supreme Court plans to take up in its next session. But I think because of this, how widespread of an effect this decision could have, I imagine the Supreme Court is going to take it up in their next session. And they will, I'm sure they will announce that ahead of their next summer session. That based on some of the recent decisions over the last 6 months, I think there's at least greater than 50% chance that the Supreme Court. My take right now is that there's, I think, a 51% chance the Supreme Court sides with Trump on this, just based on the decisions they've made, the rulings they've made in some of these other immigration-related cases.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting. It's a little, I don't know, maybe we shouldn't be too optimistic given how many times Chief Justice Roberts, the big one was back in, was it 2019 or 2020? Basically, you have Roberts saying that the Commerce Department cannot inquire about the legal or illegal status of individuals in the United States. Could not put that on the census, and it wasn't because it was illegal. It was because they didn't follow the proper protocol, or they didn't have the right paperwork. Or basically, Roberts just didn't like how they did that, even though it would have been completely legal. I don't know, Robert. I'm kind of on the edge of my seat on this one, because what Trump wants to do on birthright citizenship could be legal, but I guess there's always a risk that Robert says, "Well, I just don't like it, so I'm not going to go for it."
Well, in that case, and in a lot of these cases where the courts have said basically that, they usually cite the Administrative Procedure Act, and I think in the census case, that's why the Trump administration has gotten started with that, pushing that toward putting that question on the census early, now, instead of waiting until right before 2030 to do that, so they can get basically get around that block of the courts using the Administrative Procedures Act to block these otherwise legal actions.
Mm-hmm. All right, and then my only other question here is, if the Supreme Court does rule that Trump can use executive orders on this to end birthright citizenship in most cases for non-citizens or for the children of non-citizens, is it going to take an act of Congress, maybe under a future Democrat administration and future House and Senate Democrat majorities, to codify this into law? Or what can Democrats do if the Supreme Court does side with Trump?
Yeah, I think they would. I think Democrats would move to do that because that would preempt any kind. And following administration just redoing this through executive order or getting a court decision, because the act of it would be constant. Basically, they would pass or would have to pass a bill or would want to pass a bill in order to prevent exactly what's happening now, where the Trump administration is trying to get this under the jurisdiction of redefined through executive order.
All right. Thanks for that, Robert. And let's go ahead and move on and talk about. So this is interesting. Wasn't there a Supreme Court ruling? There was some court ruling that said illegal immigrants, non-citizens can be police officers in the United States, even though they're not citizens. And we have seen, and then this opens a can of worms basically for, well, if they're not here, if they're not citizens, how can they own or carry a firearm in the United States? And apparently some of them have had problems with that. So what's the latest?
So ICE arrested an illegal immigrant who overstayed their visa. He's a Jamaican national named John Luke Evans, who overstayed his visa in 2023. And it turns out he was actually working as a police officer for Old Orchard Beach Police Department in Maine. He was only caught because he was flagged attempting to purchase a firearm. In ICE, apparently another ICE arrest in Maine earlier this year. I think it was in April. They arrested a Congolese national who was working as a corrections officer for Cumberland County Sheriff's Department, also in Maine, and also only caught him because he attempted to purchase a firearm. This basically happens because there are multiple states in the United States that their state level law does not require citizenship for being hired as a law enforcement officer. There's actually what's effectively an NGO called the Law Enforcement Immigration Task Force. And they're made up of board members who are either current or former police chiefs, or in one case, I think even a Customs and Border Protection chief. And they have members in multiple states. I think they said 150 departments that are members of this, in 30 states that are members of this organization. And they pointed out in 2017 in a paper I found that these departments have been looking at non-citizens, specifically under federal law. They have to be legal permanent residents or some other type of deferred status in order to hire them to make up recruiting shortages. And this was going on apparently as early as 2017. And one big example of a large department is the LAPD, who currently has 13 officers who fall under the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, which is an illegal status. They just have deferred action, and they're actually expanding that program. So I think despite these legal hurdles for possession of firearms, like in the case of DACA recipients, they're only allowed to have possession of a firearm while they're on duty, according to federal law. There are more states looking to recruit non-citizens, and I think it's possible that more of these visa overstays or people who have some kind of other immigration status that are not legal permanent residents have slipped through and gotten employment as law enforcement officers.
Mm-hmm. Certainly. All right. Somewhat shocking. Thanks for that, Robert. And let's move on to talk about this trade deal. This was very significant. I noticed this hit the news, Jared, on Sunday, and then the markets reacted overwhelmingly positive. I think U.S. futures for the S&P hit new highs on this. And I just briefly, I follow a bunch of finance people on X, and one of them said it's irrational that you would have investors buying on this news, I don't think it's irrational at all. We're talking about a weaker dollar. I mean, the dollar is going to get a little bit stronger and a little bit weaker. It's just going to go up and down. But over the long term, we're talking about a weaker dollar. We're talking about 0% tariffs on U.S. exports to Europe, which means U.S. products are going to be a lot more competitive over there. With the falling dollar, they're going to be cheaper over there as well. It sounds like a reason to buy to me. Jared, it looks like to me, I mean, we have the bottom line here. It looks to me like Trump took the EU to the woodshed, and maybe there's some real politicking going on, maybe some just very stark and frank discussions. But the EU completely caved to the Trump administration, to the negotiators. What's the latest? Just hit the high points of this trade deal.
Some pretty huge investments inside of the United States for numerous industries. Nearly $1 trillion worth of EU buying energy exports. The EU is going to have tariffs. The U.S. isn't. Not even on industrial goods. So we're going to sell all of our industrial goods to them. We're even going to keep our metal tariffs on them. We're also, both parties are required to develop a rules of origin so that you don't end up with like Chinese goods going to EU to like undercut the tariffs, or any American goods that are important being passed through on to China.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah. So big news all around. I do just briefly want to point this out. I don't even know who this guy is, but he's on X. And I thought what he said was incredibly insightful and 100% accurate. He said, quote, "I'm generally a staunch defender of the economics profession, but the fact that an 80-year-old reality show star and his ragtag crowd of like 5 Alabama University undergrads are running circles around 10,000 PhDs for a year now does raise some questions one cannot ignore." Well, as an Alabama alum, I'll take that as a compliment. But this is absolutely true. I mean, not to carry water cheerlead here, but Trump has had an incredibly successful year so far in this administration. A lot of this stuff also goes back to Fortress North America. And Trump came in with this radical tariff plan. Scott Bessent came in with this. Last year he wrote this when he was still running a hedge fund. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent wrote this white paper on how to restructure basically global trade and U.S. manufacturing, how to make the United States more competitive, how to reindustrialize the United States. And they've pursued that strategy, and there's been a just nonstop kind of bitching and moaning and complaining about it. But from my perspective, and I would tell you if I didn't think this was the case, from my perspective, I think Trump has been extremely successful, and the whole administration has been extremely successful in building a footing for really, I mean, we're talking about kind of global realignment here. With that, Robert, you and I, before the show, were talking about Stephen Mirren's paper that he also wrote last year. What's his official title in the Trump administration? Like trade advisor or something?
Yeah, he's the White House economic advisor, I believe.
Oh, yeah, there you go. Yeah. All right. So, one of the things that he was talking about was tariffs. How to use tariffs at a strategic level, targeted strategic tariffs, to move manufacturing back to the United States. And if you can, just state that case briefly.
So Mirren's case is that the United States is running into the Triffin Dilemma, and things like the negative trade balances and the huge foreign capital inflows into the United States have undermined U.S. defense industrial capacity. And his argument before Trump took office, I think aimed at the Trump administration, was that the U.S. needs to basically force our trading partners to shoulder some of the burden of U.S. hegemony and the U.S. reserve currency so that we can reindustrialize, especially defense production, so that we can provide some of this security umbrella that our trade partners expect. Because we can't do that if we can't produce defense materials.
Mm-hmm. A couple of weeks ago, I talked about a book, and I've since looked up the title. It's called Keep from All Thoughtful Men. It's about the economics of World War II, and just what it pulls back the curtain on production, logistics, the money part of World War II. It's a fascinating book if you like economics and military history. But one of the sections in that book talks about the discussions with FDR and Churchill, and they're in London and they're talking about how do we produce the weapons, or where do we produce the weapons that the Allies need to fight World War II? And Churchill said, well, we're closest. Let's manufacture them here. And then you have this Frenchman, and he has this picture of the UK, and then he's got this picture of the United States, and he puts the picture of the UK on top of, or the Great Britain on top of the United States. And he makes the case that the United States needs to be the industrial power. The United States needs to be making the weapons, a majority of the weapons to fight the war. And it sure seems like this is the reality for Europe. I don't know the backroom handshakes or the deals. I don't know what the EU is getting out of this, other than the United States being, quote unquote, the arsenal for democracy. By the way, that was not an FDR thing. That was the Frenchman is the one that said the United States should be the arsenal of democracy. And then FDR copped it, which is history. But Robert, just looking at this, I guess that's the first reality, is that the United States may have told the EU in I don't know how they said this, but it sure seems like the EU economy is being sacrificed for the United States economy. And this is something that Scott Bessent basically has talked about, is if the Europeans want to save Europe, they cannot do it without the United States. And it sure seems like the United States is not only in the driver's seat, and we can talk about the dollar, and we can talk about treasuries, and whether it's a safe haven asset, and whether there's foreign demand, and whether the dollar is going to zero, and whether foreign investors are going to continue buying treasuries. But for now, they are. And for now, the dollar is still the strongest, or most relatively strongest and most stable currency in the world. It's the most desired, most in demand currency in the world. And the United States is still in the driver's seat. So I think we're far more resilient than maybe some U.S. detractors would give us credit for. But it really does look like President Trump or his negotiators just basically dictated to Europe what's going to happen. And von der Leyen said, okay.
Yeah, I think based on the Stephen Mirren paper, what Bessent has written and said, and what Michael Every has pointed out about the economic statecraft strategy, or the macro grand strategy, I think this is the playbook that the Trump administration is going with, which leads me to the conclusion. I think there's a really good probability that they did exactly that these negotiators from the White House went to the European Union negotiators and laid out this case that, well, if you want our security umbrella, we need to be able to produce the means of that security. And in order to do that, you need to shoulder some of this burden. And that I think there's a good chance that that's what got the EU on board with this deal that on the surface level looks to be basically no gain for the EU and all gain for the United States.
They're just, in terms of the details that we know, there's no other way to view this trade deal other than this is a huge win for the United States. It is a loss for the European economy because we get slapped with 0% tariffs, at least on our industrial goods. All right. Thanks for that, Robert. Just another win. And I would say another step towards this whole Fortress North America concept. This is something that some folks in the Trump administration have talked about, basically making North America kind of an unassailable target as if we go through the next 5, 10, 20 years of global realignment. And it's one thing that leads me, just briefly, Michael Every has talked about the Triffin Dilemma and why we're going to have the end of the dollar system. And this is not a matter of if, it is a matter of when. And again, just the Triffin Dilemma says, this was back in the 1960s. You have this economist named Robert Triffin, and he actually went and told Congress back in 60 or 61, look, the dollar system that we have now is going to end. And the reason why it was always going to end, as Michael Every says, is because when you have a world reserve currency, your currency has to be your primary export. You cannot make and sell things abroad because when you're selling things, you're taking in dollars. And if you want to have a world reserve currency, you want to have liquidity, those dollars cannot be being sucked into the United States. They've got to be pushed out abroad. So that makes the United States needs to be a net buyer, not a net seller. And what that effectively does is it means the United States has to export its production abroad. It can be done more cheaply abroad, which is one reason why we've had relatively low inflation since kind of globalization, because things are made more cheaply abroad. But that makes the United States a net buyer, and we don't produce anything. And one of the most insightful things Michael Every has said, and he said many of them, is that the United States has decided to specialize in financial services, and China has decided to specialize in production. And as a result, the United States cannot make enough of what it needs to be military, to keep our military competitiveness. We can't produce the aircraft carriers and the ships and the missiles and the munitions and all the things that we need to stay on top. And the Trump administration came in and said, well, this has got to change. It's going to be painful, but this is something that we have to do. And so ultimately, as Michael Every says, the next dollar system, the dollar's not going away. It's probably just not going to be a global currency. It is probably going to be displaced across large parts of the world and probably stay the most dominant currency in the Western hemisphere, but we just won't have the global reach like we used to. And this is not an overnight thing. This is a strategic trend. This is just something that's going to play out over the long term. But it sure seems like the Trump administration kind of knows what time it is, and we are moving towards that reality. That's going to change a lot of things for us here in the United States. Talking about it's inflationary. We're going to have much higher inflation in the future. We've got to, because we've got to get our debt to GDP ratio down, and just the way that the way you avoid an acute debt crisis is basically by inflating and printing your way out. And so, these two things are going to be done simultaneously. Listen, Robert, let's dig into this in the Stephen Mirren paper, and I'll also go back and find that white paper that Scott Bessent wrote that talked about, it was literally to the T, what's happening on this global realignment, because Scott Bessent said exactly what needs to happen. Let's do a white paper for Forward Observer subscribers, and let's get that out in the next day or two. It's kind of a high point. Hit the high points white paper. All right. If you'd like that, if you'd like to understand what's really happening beyond the headlines at the highest levels of the Trump administration, head over to forwardobserver.com. We'll publish that white paper. We'll send it out and also post it in the library. You can start a free 7-day trial. If you like what we do here, join the club, forwardobserver.com. Come be a part of our mission. We'd love to have you. And with that, let's go ahead and move on here to our last item. Jared?
All right. We were just talking about producing ships.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, let's talk about rapid buildup here.
Yes, I'm stoked to see this, by the way. So the U.S. Navy issued a call for vendors to develop 3 high-endurance unmanned surface vessels for what they're calling the Modular Attack Surface Craft Program. Now, the one publicly defined concept, it requires the ability to carry 2 sets of containerized missiles and maintain a cruising speed similar to a strike group. It was 25 knots, which is about average for, everybody moving together. Now, one very important point for this is that all designs submitted must be what the Navy called non-exquisite, and a working prototype must be delivered to the Navy, and that includes, it has to be totally working, totally involved in command and control, radars, all of it, within 18 months of the contract award. Now, not exquisite means simple. That's easy to build. You can build it quick. Modular, as the modular attack surface craft, that allows them to actually, shift the mission, whether it's going to be carrying these containerized missiles or just carrying missiles for an at-sea reload. Now, when you combine those with the fast delivery, this shows that the Navy is finally taking concrete steps to close the gap between the U.S. and China on combat ship production and repair. Because if you can make them easy, you can fix them easy. And you can now rapidly deploy shooters. Everybody likes to talk about the numbers of ships and the weights of the ships. All that really matters, in my opinion, at this point is, can you deliver a missile onto target? And that heavily favors smaller, more numerous ships, not massive capital classes. Now, while the Navy does not state that these vessels will fill the role of a frigate, and technically they cannot, their rapid production and expendability make them ideal for filling that role in the interim. You can get about like 70 to 80% of a frigate's mission accomplished with these vessels, just based on the concepts that they put out. Because the main thing for a frigate is that you have to be able to shoot, kill everybody in a very close range, and also take the hit instead of the carrier. These things can do that, and you can build them quick. Now, this contract is unlikely to be fulfilled by 2027 because nobody's been awarded it yet, and they have an 18-month timeline from then. But this would allow for a much quicker replenishment of lost combat-capable ships during a war with China during the Davidson window. And if China doesn't move in 2027, they move in 2028, we may see a rapid fielding of these anyway. The Navy's been experimenting with USVs and containerized missiles for a long time, and here at Forward Observer, we've been talking about since at least 2023. Hey, all the parts are there. Put them together. Looks like the Navy's finally doing that.
Interesting. So this is like the unmanned naval equivalent of the Sherman tank, something that is standardized, it's reproducible, you can produce them in very large numbers and ship them out and get them where they need to go. Jared, is this something that South Korea can produce? Because one of the things we have talked about is that U.S. defense planners are talking about potentially building U.S. ships in South Korea because they're already over there.
I wouldn't even limit it to just South Korea. I think it was in late 23, maybe early 24, we talked about the Navy putting out a call for vendors to produce basically just the hulls that would work for these things, where you have unclassified systems. Anybody can build a boat, so you can make a lot of these things. So yeah, South Korea could make it, but so could Japan, so could Taiwan, so could the Philippines. All these could make the base level. And then for command and control, if you can just plug and play, and especially if you can throw on a couple of containerized missiles, hey, look, now there are suddenly, everybody has an additional two, I'm going to exaggerate here, but maybe you have an additional 200 total shooters. That's incredibly hard for China to defeat. And it makes allied security far more achievable, especially for nations like the Philippines and Taiwan that can't field these massive capital class ships like frigate or like cruisers and destroyers and carriers.
Mm-hmm. Jared, back in maybe 2017, I know the Navy came out with this new doctrine called distributed lethality. Mm-hmm. And that's basically what they were talking about is breaking up these large carrier groups into, or at least spreading them out over much larger surfaces. So they're much more difficult to find, much more difficult to target and kill. And it sure seems like having this constellation of unmanned vehicles that can shoot, move, and throw some sensors on there, and now they communicate. Sure seems like that's would be a big part of that distributed lethality plan. And I don't know if that's still the current doctrine. You're the Navy guy. What do you think?
Well, so all these would still be essentially tied to a manned vessel, but it would create it. You'd still have your distributed lethality, and that would allow you to take more hits as a force rather than as a unit. So if you are a destroyer with 6 USVs that are all shooters, and China's sitting there shooting your shooters, well, you can lose one of them, and you're not going to lose your entire ability, your entire offensive capability. Where if you take out the spy radar on a destroyer, you're going to significantly degrade it, if not complete a mission kill on that ship and eliminate hundreds of missiles. You could say, okay, well, I can lose a couple here, and I'm not really actually losing a lot of combat capability. It's far more enduring, and they're cheap. I cannot stress that enough. They're cheap. They're easy to produce. That is the most important thing, because that feeds into the logistics and actually waging warfare.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's good news. Thanks for staying on top of that, Jared. And with that, let's go ahead and move on. We do have some questions today. On the topic of birthright citizenship, isn't asylum given on a temporary basis until the holder can go back to their own country, but Biden handed it out like candy? I guess, yeah.
Well, I think normally asylum provides a path to citizenship, or at least legal permanent status. The Biden handing it out like candy issue was that basically they could make appointments to the CBP1 app and automatically get an application for asylum. And then the other issue with the Biden administration is that they were getting court hearings for asylum cases, and DHS lawyers were not showing up in order to basically get default judgments in favor of the asylum applicant.
Mm-hmm. There should be some accountability there. All right. A boy can dream. All right. Thanks, Robert. Another question on birthright citizenship. Would that be applied as of the date of the EO, or are they trying to retroactively apply it? So we actually have, Robert, you have talked about this trial case for denaturalization. So is this a scenario where we see maybe asylum seekers who are granted citizenship at some point have that be taken away from them?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it already happens most commonly in criminal cases. So if someone has lied about criminal background or is convicted of a crime while they're in that process, they can be denaturalized. I think so far this year, when we talked about it before, there were 9 criminal cases where people have been denaturalized. But I think the Trump administration is pushing for more civil cases, which is easier on the government to basically get to that, to prove that these people should be denaturalized, because there are apparently fewer rights granted to the person being under that civil case, the illegal immigrant or immigrant who was granted naturalization. There are fewer rights they have under that process. And based on that DOJ memo, I think they're pushing for that more. As far as the effective date of the birthright citizenship order, in the actual executive order, it doesn't actually take effect until 30 days after that order was issued, which was January 20th. So I think anyone, if this does make it through the courts, the only people who will be affected were any people born in the United States after February 20th.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. Hey, Jared, I'm going to tee this one up real quick. Do you think immigrants are protected by the Bill of Rights, either by your ethics or interpretation of the Constitution? Listen, the whole argument that rights are granted by God is not lost on me. In a perfect world, yes, those rights extend to all of humanity. Do I want 1 million Venezuelans or 1 million Chinese coming into the country illegally and being able to buy and carry guns? No, obviously don't. So while I can appreciate the argument, you do hit a wall, and it's called reality. And the reality of the situation is this is kind of a purity test, and there is no 100% solution. In terms of war, conflict, negotiations, everything, you're not going to get 100% of the way there. And sometimes the best you can do is a 51% solution. This is kind of like saying, oh, Mike, your home is on fire. You have to choose between putting out the fire or getting your family out. And if you don't put out the fire, it's going to burn your home down. And if you don't get your family out, they're going to die. Well, I want to do, in theory, you can maybe do both, but it's a false dichotomy, basically. So that's my personal take on it. That's the Ford Observer bottom line, is that, yeah, we do believe here that rights are granted by God, but that should not extend to everyone in our country. That's my take. Otherwise, good question. That's a debate that's obviously being had as well. Also, do you have a suggested reading list or book list? Yeah, I'll just start writing down. I've been writing a handful of book reviews this year. I'll just post all those for Ford Observer subscribers. So if you're interested in the books that I'm reading and kind of want a book review and see what a book's about, head over to FordObserver.com. In the meantime, yes, I do have a reading list. I will finish it out, and I will get that to everyone. And I'll ask Robert and Jared, because I know they're big readers as well. All right, Jared, any other questions for us? Did you guys hear that Trump basically threatened them with the U.S. leaving NATO in order to get the trade deal? I did not hear that. It would not surprise me. I think that's part of the realpolitik, and just basically telling the EU in no uncertain terms, you're not going to be able to save yourself without the United States. And in effect, we're basically sacrificing the EU economy to prop up the United States economy. Europe can't do it without the United States economy. Nobody can do anything without the U.S. economy. no one can do anything if we can't make the things that we need, we being the U.S. I would not be surprised at all to hear that. Robert, Jared, have y'all heard that?
I haven't, but I think that actually reinforces the idea that the Trump administration is using this playbook that Bessett, Mirren, and Every have laid out. Because if the United States can't basically force our trade partners to shoulder some of this burden that is causing the deindustrialization of the defense industrial base, then I think the argument the Trump administration would make is that there's no reason for the U.S. to be in NATO then if we can't actually provide that security umbrella.
Yeah, I did not hear that, but I actually don't think he would, because it counteracts the messaging he's given in the last couple months, where he came out and said, yeah, we're not leaving. He initially said, yes, we'll consider it. And then eventually it was like, oh, no, we're not doing it. And he had incredible meetings with the Secretary General of NATO, who then started implementing U.S. policy throughout it for, hey, Europe, we need to industrialize now. So I don't think he would. Not to mention if he came back and said, hey, we will consider it, I think that would actually show it would be him testing the Europeans to see if they're thinking about second order effects in the American context. Because as long as the United States has major non-NATO allies who are, per the writing, supposed to be treated as if they are members of NATO without Article 5 for everybody else, if you leave NATO, what does that mean for the major non-NATO allies? Now Taiwan goes, oh, well, they can leave because they're just as legally bound to NATO as they are to us. That applies to Taiwan, the Philippines, and Japan. There would be major second order effects for actually following through on that threat. And if he used it and it was successful, that shows the Europeans are not thinking about that.
Well, there's an IR scholar I recommend a lot, John Mearsheimer. He's an offensive realist. He wrote a really good book that I also recommend called Why Leaders Lie. And he makes the case that leaders, when they do lie, it's for domestic consumption. So I think if Trump did use this threat with the EU, but said publicly in U.S. media that he was not considering it, that might be an example where Trump was strategically lying for domestic consumption for, I think, probably political purposes, to avoid any, resistance domestically, while going to the EU and using that as leverage to get this trade deal, if that's what happened.
Yeah, it was just a few weeks ago. Maybe all of these European NATO countries, I don't know if Spain ever did or not, but they committed to that 5%. Most of them, I believe, committed to that 5% spending goal, which is something that Trump's wanted back during the first term, basically for Europe to be spending more. So it kind of seems like Europe has been fulfilling a little quid pro quo there. And maybe this EU trade deal is the quo for the quid. All right, there was a couple other questions here, Jared. Can we tackle that Michael Every question here, please? Now, listen, I'm a huge Michael Every fan. I will tell you my understanding of what he says. I obviously can't argue his points as well as he can. However, there was one question about Michael Every. He's the global strategist over at Rabobank. Just next level thinker. He's been talking about this stuff for a long, long time. The things that we are seeing now. Blues Boy says Michael Every makes some great points, but I'm wondering if he sees the global economics as a zero-sum game. Also not sure if he factors in innovation. I'm sure Every factors in innovation. He's a very, very astute guy, both in kind of classical economic sense and then also in just like plain realpolitik, real ground level, real world understanding of how power is used on a global stage. I can't tell you. I would imagine he probably sees global economics between the U.S. and China. Well, I don't know. I don't want to put words in his mouth. It's a good question. Maybe we can ask him. I can't answer. I'm not going to answer that for him. All right. Yeah. If you need to cut social media out, but you'd like to stay informed, yeah, Clark, if you're not already, head over to forwardobserver.com. Go sign up. Not only we get our report emailed out every day, we'll also have the watch floor up and running now. So it's kind of like a Twitter feed, but only for relevant stuff. So for news and intel that we come across during the day, you don't have to wait till tomorrow's report to get it. We post that stuff in there throughout the day. And if you got a few minutes, you want to see what the latest, what's going on. You could waste hours on Twitter or just head over to the Ford Observer watch floor, scroll for a couple minutes, and get caught up. What about the China factor in the EU? Well, this goes back to, I think, under Obama, actually, even before Trump came on board. It was 2015, maybe 2016. The Chinese sent a delegation to talk to the EU, and basically they said, look, break your major trade ties with the United States, come align with China. We'll produce everything you need for cheap, and we want to be your major trade partner. We want to replace the United States for the EU. And the EU said, no thanks. And that was like a big, China was swinging for the fences there. I get it's kind of a vague question about the China factor in the EU, but I know that Europe has a lot of problems, and individual countries in Europe, especially NATO countries, are going to have much larger problems with China in the future because they keep sending their aircraft carriers down to the Indo-Pacific. So I don't know, Jared, how do you see this question?
I think this was a major factor. Just there, we talked about it since Trump took office. It's like the EU is an important power, but it's a second tier power. It's competing between the United States and China, and it's got to choose one of them. They're not going to go to China. And part of that is that China keeps flooding their markets. Even with the US buying all kinds of cheap Chinese crap, China's still flooding the EU markets. Mm-hmm. And the EU all EU nations keep constantly bringing that up. Hey, you have to stop this. We just covered Ursula von der Leyen telling Xi Jinping that explicitly is you have to stop this stuff. Otherwise, our relationship is not sustainable. So is it a factor in the EU-US trade deal? Absolutely. It's probably, I won't say it's the main factor, but I think there's an argument to be made that it could be, because the United States is not necessarily going to just dump stuff into the EU, even though we have an exceptionally powerful trade deal with them. And that said, even if you take out the economics, look at what that would actually mean for Europe. Europe's primary security threat per all of them is Russia. If you ally with China economically, you're allying with Russia economically, and you're feeding your stated main security threat. That doesn't make any sense either. Basically, the EU pigeonholed itself into having to either suddenly become a tier 1 power, which it's not going to do, or ally with the United States until it can.
Mm-hmm. Jared, I think those are excellent points. Let's bring Robert on briefly, and let's go back and tie Michael Every back into this, because, again, one of the most insightful things he said is that the United States has just chosen to specialize in financial services. We make money off of money, but we don't make things. We don't make what we need in enough quantities, and we can't make it fast enough. China, on the other hand, is specialized in production. They make everything that they need, and they make it fast. And that's a really tough way to fight a war, not being able to make the things that you need fast enough. And so one of the things that Every has talked about is this economic statecraft. And one of the things that you've also talked about kind of at a grand strategic level is using your economic power to build military power. And that's economic statecraft. And that is exactly what we're seeing here from the Trump administration.
Yeah, that's the most basic measure of state power. I think if you're to ask somebody like a realist, an offensive realist like John Mearsheimer, is a state power is measured by the capacity to transform economic power into military power. And this playbook outlines how they're trying to do this by reindustrializing, because you need, everybody will point, the critics of the Trump administration or critics of this idea over the last couple of years has said we can just ramp up production of tanks and bombs and stuff. But I think it's been proven we can't. And part of that that middle area of this playbook of why we can't do that is because you need toaster factories, you need microwave factories, you need car factories to be able to transform them into tank factories and bomb factories and drone factories. You can't just plop down a drone factory in the middle of a field and suddenly start producing military materials in the middle of a conflict. you need that economic capacity to already exist to transform. And the analogy here is World War II. Like, everybody looks at the World War II ramp up in U.S. military production, but the reality is that started years before the United States entered the war. A lot of those factories that were transformed into plane factories were car factories. A lot of that, the naval production actually started ramping up, I think 7 years before the U.S. entered the war. And I think that's what the Trump administration is basically looking at here is, in order to actually have the capacity to turn that economic power into military power, you have to rebuild that economic power, and that's production, not financialization.
Mm-hmm. Well, that is the strategic reality, and fighting to catch up, way behind the curve. All right, Jared, Robert, thanks so much for that. And thank you at home for watching. That's going to do it for today's morning briefing. Hey, if you like what we do and you want to be a part of our mission, which is being able to anticipate the future, looking at current trends and looking at what they could look like in the future, and then tying those expectations of the future at a strategic or operational level, tying that back down to the tactical level. What can you do about this? What is a war with China going to look like? How is it going to affect you? What happens when we do have the end of the dollar system and the dollar is no longer the world reserve currency? It is definitely the regional reserve currency. How does that affect you? What should you do? Come join us at Forward Observer. We're going to be doing a lot more of this stuff in the future, really tying this into more tactical steps that you can take to be prepared for the future that we all know is going to happen. It's only a matter of time. So with that, everyone, forwardobserver.com. That's not a real dog behind me. That's a coyote. Last question of the day. We appreciate your support. Thanks for watching. We'll be back in your inbox tomorrow morning, back on the show starting at 08 Central Time. Until then, be well and stay out front.